I want to start with a question you've probably never thought of before. Okay, what is the speed of God? Hey, don't worry, there's no equations involved here. Hey, what is the speed of God? Have you ever thought that before, ever tried to figure that out? I mean, how would you even begin to figure out something like that? Well, I propose if we want to know the speed of God, we should look to Jesus, right? Because he was God in the flesh. And in Jesus, we see God moving, ready for this, at the speed of walking. Okay, there weren't any trains, planes, or automobiles when he was here on the earth. Now, the speed of walking, if you're wondering, is roughly 3 miles per hour. Okay, that's the average speed that a human being walks. And man, 3 miles an hour. God, at 3 miles an hour, that seems so slow to us today. In a world of interstate highways where 70 is kind of the recommended speed, 3 miles an hour feels like forever. Okay, we've all probably been stuck in a traffic jam before, and it's so disruptive to our schedules. I just think of the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. I'm late, I'm late, I'm late. That's kind of how our life goes. And we live in a time and place where words like efficient, time-saving, instant are praised, where 4G cell phone speed isn't enough. Now we're rolling out 5G. And I say all that as someone who is on board with all of it. I love all the new technology. Okay, all the time-saving gadgets, or maybe better noted as time-wasting. I'll leave that up to you. But we live in this tension between the speed of our world and this 3 mile an hour speed of our God. Have you ever felt that? In his book, The 3 Mile an Hour God, Japanese theologian Kazuki Koyama speaks to this tension. He says, love has its speed. It's a spiritual speed. It is a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we are accustomed. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we notice it or not, at 3 miles an hour. It is the speed we walk, and therefore the speed of the love of God walks. Okay, I wonder if it's possible to outpace God, to be moving at such a hairy pace that we blow past God. We fail to notice him. And so on this one side, we have this pace of our world, right? This hurry-sickened, stressed out pace of life. And on the other side, we have the speed of God, a God who calls us to, as the psalmist says in Psalm 46, verse 10a, like, be still and know that I am God. How do we break the hurry sickness? How do we make space to be still and know God, to enter into the speed of love that he walks? Today we're continuing in our series, Running with Purpose, where we're looking at different, various spiritual disciplines that help us set a pace for growth. Or as we're discussing today, a pace to hear from God. And so far we've talked about the disciplines of scripture reading, of fellowship, and then last week we talked about the discipline of prayer. And I would encourage you, if you've missed any of the messages in this series so far, they're all available on our website, oasis.com, or on our YouTube page as well. And the discipline that we're going to look at today that really helps to break our hurry-sickened pace is the disciplines of silence and solitude. And we're going to get 2 of those today. Both of these kind of work in tandem. It's sort of like peanut butter and jelly, right? They just go together. And if I could sum up the message today in a big idea, it would be this: a slow pace makes space to hear from God. A slow pace makes space to hear from God. And I want to take some time to look at what it means to practice silence and solitude, okay, how they work in our everyday lives. But first, I want to focus on Jesus, because we see him exemplify how solitude and silence make space to hear from God, right? This 3 mile an hour God, we look to Jesus. And what I find so amazing about Jesus is that he always had time for others. His entire ministry was only 3.5 years. I mean, for our time, think back to the summer of 2018. I know that seems like forever ago. in our current pandemic world. But between July of 2018 and today would kind of encompass the entirety of Jesus' ministry. And in that time, he started a kingdom movement that has transformed our world. In fact, the entire system that we use to determine years is based on Jesus. That's incredible. I don't want to think about all that I haven't accomplished since 2018. Maybe then maybe adding some quarantine weight. Imagine you had 3 years to change the world. And I get Jesus was God in the flesh, but just imagine the pace of life we probably have in order to try and accomplish that task. And yet we look at Jesus, and he was always being interrupted. It's so hard to get things done when you're being interrupted, right? And not only that, but there were times that his interruptions were interrupted by somebody else. Yet this pace of our God, our 3-mile-an-hour God, who was never rushed, who walked with pace or purpose in every step. How do we even start to live at that kind of pace? Well, a key practice for Jesus that connect to our pace of life is solitude and silence. And we see Jesus practice these throughout his ministry. I just want to share a few examples from his life. He began his ministry by spending 40 days alone in the desert. And before he chose the 12 apostles, he spent the entire night alone in the desert hills. And when he received the news of John the Baptist's death, he withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place apart. And then we see after the miraculous feeding of the 5,000, Jesus went up into the hills by himself to pray. And then we look at, following a long night of work. He says, in the morning, a great while before day, he rose and went out to a lonely place. That's in Mark 1:35. And when the 12 returned from preaching and healing and this mission that Jesus had sent them on, Jesus instructed them, come away by yourselves to a lonely place. And following the healing of a leper, Jesus withdrew to the wilderness and prayed. With 3 of his disciples, he sought out the silence of a lonely mountain as the stage for the transfiguration. And as he prepared for his arrest and ultimate crucifixion, we read about Jesus seeking out the solitude of the Garden of Gethsemane. And listen, I could go on, but this is just kind of gives us a snapshot just to show us that seeking out of silence and solitude, these things were a religious practice for Jesus. So it should be for us as well. If Jesus needed this, we need this. And just so we have a simple definition of solitude, let me just share this with you. Solitude is primarily about not doing something. Okay, when we go into solitude, we intentionally withdraw from conversation, from the presence of others, from noise, okay, from the constant barrage of stimulation. Okay, which is why silence pairs so well here. It's an opportunity, as Henry Nouwen, the great theologian, says, to get rid of the scaffolding. And the scaffolding, it's all the stuff we use to keep ourselves propped up. The stuff we use to convince ourselves that we're important or we're okay. In solitude and in silence, we have no friends to talk with, no phone calls or meetings, no television sets or smartphones, no music or books or newspapers to occupy and distract the mind. It's silencing the outside voices. And depending on your living situation, that may either sound exciting or it may sound depressing. And as someone with a family in my home, the thought of being somewhere quiet and away from the chaos of life sounds so enticing. Okay, there is a draw there for someone in my situation. But I know for others, you may live alone, whether on purpose or not. You may find at times life is lonely and isolated, and the thought of solitude is more like dread, because it feels like more of the same of your everyday life. And I just want to quickly hit this. There's a distinct difference between being alone and practicing solitude. In loneliness, we feel isolated with a sense that something is missing. Rather, in solitude and silence, we purpose to be alone in order to hear from God. And as the passage we looked at earlier instructs, right, be still and know that God is God, that He is God. And one great example of this comes from the life of the prophet Elijah. And in 1 Kings 19, in the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, we see that he's on the run, fearing for his life after this iconic battle on Mount Carmel between Elijah and the whole of the prophets of Baal, 450 prophets of the false god Baal. And this contest was whichever God responded with fire was the true God. And Baal never showed up, and God showed off. It's an amazing story. But in the aftermath, Elijah's on the run and very discouraged. And God leads him to Mount Sinai, which is a really kind of important place. It's known as God's mountain. And he's there, and he's desperately longing to hear from God. And so we're going to pick up the story in 1 Kings 19, starting in verse 11. "Go out and stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. And I love this in verse 13. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. What a beautiful description of how God speaks. It wasn't right in the wind, this violent wind. It wasn't in the earthquake or the fire, but it was the gentle whisper. When Elijah heard the sound of the gentle whisper, right, he knew God was there. And I get this. We so often desire for God to speak in loud and obvious ways. I know there have been so many times where I've told God, I've complained to God, just saying, would you just tell me what you want? Would you just make it obvious? Would you just audibly tell me? But God longs to woo us. He longs for us to come close. I mean, think about it. How do you hear a gentle whisper? Right? You have to lean in close. And when we look to the practices of solitude and silence, it's intentionally leaning in close, right? Removing ourselves from the chaos of the wind and the earthquakes and the fires around us in order to hear from God. And there are two ways that I want to talk about that we can practice solitude and silence. And the first is take advantage of the little solitudes that fill our day. See, unlike Elijah, you don't have to travel 40 days and nights in order to find a place of solitude. That seems like a lot of work, right? I mean, there are moments in our everyday lives that can provide opportunities to practice this, like an inner solitude and silence. Okay, just think about your daily routine. Hey, where can you find some of those little solitudes? I know for me, I've come to relish early mornings because it's the only part of my day that I can control. Nobody calls me at 5 a.m. Okay, there's no urgent emails. My wife and my kids are still asleep. It's time where I can make space to hear from God. And often I find that those moments, of just sipping a cup of coffee at Starbucks, or if it's the summertime, I like to head to a park. Those are moments where I can hear from God, those little inner solitude moments. And what could those daily moments look like for you? Think about your daily routine. Maybe it's while enjoying your morning cup of coffee. Could be while you shower, right? I mean, you're just doing the thing. Your mind is not occupied. It's time where you can spend with God. Maybe it's during your commute to or from work. Maybe it's an afternoon walk or as you work in your garden. Maybe it's while you stand in the checkout line at the grocery store. It could be the bookends of your day as you lay in bed. It can be really any time that we choose to put down our phones and quiet our minds and our hearts and just make space to be with God. It's this inner silence. Maybe there's noise, there's things around you, but it's this inner silence. And if your phone is a barrier to solitude and silence, then set up Do Not Disturb or just turn it off. Okay, everything will be fine. Just hear that. Everything will be fine. The world will keep moving along just fine without you being connected to it. And I'm saying that to myself, okay? But beyond the daily moments of little solitude, another way to practice this is to schedule times of intentional solitude. Okay, that's another way. Schedule times of intentional solitude. And the word schedule is probably the most crucial. You see, solitude requires relentless perseverance. I find that if I pull my calendar out and schedule well in advance times when I'm committed to silence and solitude, if I don't do that, it's not going to happen. So what would it look like to schedule maybe just half a day each month to intentionally practice solitude and silence? What would it mean for your pace of life this year if you made space, right? Made space to hear from God. I hope there's something in you that jumps at that thought, that excites you at that endeavor, because God longs to speak, for us to slow our pace, to lean in, to make space for Him to speak, to be still, right, and know that He is God. And I've built into my calendar what is called a replenish day. It's an intentional half a day for me to practice solitude and silence. And ideally, I try to do this once a month, but it doesn't always happen. I'm not as intentional as I should be, right? If I don't schedule it, it's not likely to happen. And you may be thinking, what would I do for half a day? What would I do if taking an intentional time for solitude and silence? Well, let me share what a typical replenish days look like for me. So typically after breakfast or even the night before, I decide where I want to go. Because I love to spend my replenish days, as I call them, at a state park or on a hike or somewhere out in nature. Okay, maybe that's not your thing, but I find God speaks to me more when I'm out walking in nature. And we have some amazing parks right here in our backyard, Seahurst being one of the best, in my opinion. But when I get to my destination, the first thing I do is I turn off my phone, and that gets left in the car. Right? Again, the goal is to turn off the outside voices and distractions. All I will bring with me is a Bible, a notebook, and a water bottle. And as I walk, as I hike, I talk with God. I notice the beauty in nature around me. I seek to be aware of my thoughts and my feelings and allow them to sort of redirect me back to God. And one of my favorite passages of Scripture to read and meditate on while I'm doing a replenish day is Psalm 23. It's one of my all-time favorite passages and speaks, I think, so well to the purposes of solitude and silence. In fact, in Psalm 23, if you read just those first 3 verses, it says this. You're probably familiar with it. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Like He leads me beside quiet waters. And I love this in verse 3. He refreshes my soul. See, that's a key aspect of solitude and silence. As we sort of strip away, right, all the scaffolding around us, as we make space to be with God, we can be refreshed. Right? That's something we all need in the chaos of life. Right? Still water, green pastures for us to be refreshed. Right? That just sounds so enticing. And so I typically will hike, I'll pray, I'll read and reflect on Scripture for a few hours, and then I'll wrap up that time by journaling what I sense God is speaking to me. And it's a way for me to cement and record those moments. And I can look back at future days of solitude and silence to sort of see how God has consistently been speaking to me over the months and years. And the last thing I do for me personally, one of the ways I sense God's goodness is through enjoying a good meal. So I typically end a replenish day at a fun new restaurant that I haven't tried before. I usually try to find one on Yelp that looks exciting to me. And I don't share all that just to say do what I do, but rather to give you some inspiration to think outside the box. And if you could spend half a day with God, what would that look like? Where would you go? What would you long to do? How do you best hear from God? What would refresh your soul? Okay, take time to think about that. Then get it on your calendar and connect with those who would be impacted by you being off the radar for half a day. And as I start to wrap up this message, I just want to sort of go back to where we started, right? The speed of God. Is it possible that we can outpace God in the harried speed of our daily lives? I believe it's possible. And I'm positive there are times I've missed God speaking because I wasn't in a place to hear from Him. I was too busy putting out the fires or fighting the wind or the earthquake, and I couldn't hear God's gentle whisper. If Jesus needed time to be in solitude and silence, if He needed time with the Father, you better believe we do as well. So how do we slow down? How do we get our pace down to God's speed? I think we need what I'm going to call spiritual speed bumps. Right? What's the purpose of a speed bump? Right? It's to slow you down. Have you ever missed a speed bump? Right? You definitely notice it. It will make itself known to you. The disciplines of solitude and silence are those spiritual speed bumps that cause us to slow down, to move at the pace of love, the pace of our 3-mile-an-hour God. And as I wrap up this message, here's just a few next steps. And the first, as always, is become a follower of Jesus. Hey, maybe you've been chasing hard after life. You've been looking for purpose and meaning in the things around you because, right, you know deep down something's missing in you. And the thought of being in solitude, it may freak you out because you're trying to outpace the brokenness inside. And if you slow down, it's there. I get that. We can all struggle with that. And the beautiful thing is that Jesus calls us to come to Him, to take up His way of living, to experience the loving pace of God. A God that stepped out of heaven and into the limitations of His creation. He came in close, right? He leaned in order to rescue us from this harried, meaningless hamster wheel we can all run on. He wants to give you true life and give it to you fully. Come to Jesus, receive the love and the mercy He has promised for you. And if that's you today, would you let someone in your home church know? We'd love to pray for you and help you take next steps in following Jesus. And another next step, just again, based out of sort of these two ways of practicing solitude, is practice little solitudes. As I have already talked about, where are those moments in your everyday life where you can begin to practice inner solitude? Those moments where you can kind of quiet your heart and your mind and be still, right? Be with God. Be still and know that He is God. And again, it may be in the midst of some really loud stuff going on around you, but how can you kind of quiet? Where are those times you can quiet your heart and your mind to be with God? And the last next step, again, based on these two practices of solitude and silence, is schedule an intentional time of solitude. I would challenge you to start somewhere. Maybe it's just blocking out a couple hours, maybe an hour or two, where you can build in a spiritual speed bump, right, to slow your pace and hear from God. And if you aren't sure what to do, take some time and reflect on how you've heard from God in the past. Maybe it's just looking at the forecast and choosing a nice weather day to go for a hike, or if it's not a nice weather day, to sit in at a coffee shop. Start somewhere and allow God to slow your pace, to make room for you to hear from Him. I hope you've been encouraged as we continue to walk through this series on spiritual disciplines, right? The goal is that we would be inspired to take on some of these tools, right? That allow us to grow far this year. God bless Oasis.